In the last video, we talked about challenges to French nationalism. Today, we'll talk a bit about the roots of Canadian and British nationalism, or Canadian and American nationalism, as well as some challenges to them. So, one of the key events in American nationalism is the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party is seen as the spark that lit the American Revolution. The very, very basic overview of the Boston Tea Party is that it happened in 1773. It was after Britain had fought a ton of wars, mostly with France, which left their treasury drained, kind of running in parallel here with one another. And at the time, America was a British colony. So since one of those wars had been the 7-Year War, which had been fought against France, and the British felt that, this was done to protect the Americas, that the colonials should be the ones to kind of chip in to help pay for it. So Britain instituted a number of taxes on goods traveling from Britain to America. Technically, they actually lowered taxes, but they also enforced the taxes. And they cracked down very hard on smugglers, particularly smugglers of tea. Yes, there were smugglers of tea. And that did not sit well with the colonists, who felt that they were being taxed, but they also weren't being represented in the British Parliament of the time. They had no say and no ability to take control of, this is what we think is fair and equitable. So since they had no voice, a bunch of colonials stormed aboard some sailor ships from Britain and dumped their cargo overboard. The cargo being tea, the city being Boston, hence the Boston Tea Party. And this is rightly seen as a spark for the American Revolution. And in terms of America's national myth, it supports the vision of them being a people who love freedom and who will not tolerate tyranny, because that's their roots, rebelling against what they saw as being unfair financial policy without equivalent political rights. And that is, of course, the key thing, that the colonists weren't necessarily unwilling to pay taxes, although, pro tip for history, no one likes paying taxes ever. But it's not that they were unwilling to pay the taxes, or they thought the taxes themselves were particularly brutal, but they did not want to be taxed without being represented, without having a voice in the British Parliament. So we also should think of what other nationalist shaping factors could have influenced the American Revolution, and what other events in America's history continue to influence their forms of nationalism today. And can those be challenged? And we're going to talk about the challenges more in terms of Canada, because we are Canadian, so it's a bit more of a fair game to talk about the challenges for our own country, so that we're not just criticizing everyone else. So just like France and the United States, we have our own national myths. Vimy Ridge, the building of the Canadian railroads, the exploration of the Northwest Territories, the founding of Canada through a combination of British and French colonists, something seen nowhere else in the world. Well, mostly nowhere else in the world. All of these are part of the Canadian myth. And remember that when I talk about myths in social studies, I don't mean fairy tales, I don't mean fables, I don't mean untrue things. I mean stories that explain how a thing came into being. Those are all important parts of Canadian myth. They have built connection between Canadians through that shared history. But there are challenges to them. First Nations can challenge those myths. The Metis can challenge those myths. The Inuit can challenge those myths. And French Canadians themselves can challenge those myths. Why? Well, those are the myths of the majority. And just because they're myths of the majority doesn't mean that there isn't an aspect of truth to them. It doesn't mean that they aren't powerful. Dear Lord, they're powerful. But you can challenge the perspective from within as well. When we say that Canada is formed from French and English settlers, that is erasure of all of the First Nations, all of the Métis, and all of the Inuit who contributed to the nation's founding. That does not something that connects them to Canada, even though they live within Canada, and they have lived within that land, in fact, longer than Canadians have. The way the myth often gets phrased is it gets presented by Anglophile Canadians, which means that our projections, sometimes as Anglo, sometimes as Westerners, because there is the whole West versus East dynamic in Canada too, that presentation can alter or change the way we present the myth. So when the narrative is then in the control of French Canadians, their narrative might be different from ours. And that challenges our narrative. And if it doesn't make it clear from the tone of my voice, a challenge is not a bad thing. Me as a person, not me as a teacher, me as a person welcomes and embraces those challenges, because those challenges help us to clarify who we are. And change is not necessarily a bad thing. But we have to think carefully about what stories, what myths do we tell about our nation? And what's the meaning behind those myths? Who do those myths leave out? And that is where the challenges often come from. A myth may be representative of an actual thing, of actual forces and trends that have acted in history. But myths also leave people out. And the things that aren't mentioned are just as important as the things that are.